stressed me out. But what I thought was a solution turned out to be a problem. I kept hearing ads about debt settlement that seemed too good to be true. And actually, it was. When I called, they told me to stop paying my bills. That didn't sound right to me at all, so I hung up. Later, I found out that debt settlement is bad, real bad. Then I learned that there is a right way to pay off your credit cards. It's called a debt management program from the great team at Trinity. Trinity had a plan. In the end, I paid off my bills, I saved thousands, and I even improved my credit score.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813.
My name is Heather. Please forget debt settlement and remember Trinity Debt Management.
1-800-788-1813. What does a former Muslim, now Christian, believe about the Israel-Hamas conflict, and also how to evangelize Muslims? We're talking to Ridvan Ademir. He is the Apostate Prophet on YouTube. 600,000 subscribers, 944 videos. Some of these videos have millions of views for good reason. Ridvan knows what he's talking about, and he's not afraid to point out the problems with Islam. And one of the problems we started to talk about just before the break, Ridvan, had to do with the Islamic dilemma. We talked about that on this program with you a couple of sessions ago, but re-educate us on that and this new angle on this Islamic dilemma.
Yeah, so the Islamic dilemma is basically an argument that is that certain people like my friend David Wood have popularized a lot, and it's airtight. It is a very solid argument that directly refutes Islam by its own inherent, by its own logic. You know, it's an internal critique that exposes Islam as completely incoherent. So it basically goes that the Quran itself affirms the divine revelation and preservation and authenticity and authority of what it calls the Torah and the Gospel, in Arabic Injil, which comes from the Greek Evangelion, and so it commands the Jews and the Christians in Muhammad's time to actually still hold on to the Torah and to the Gospel and to judge by them. It says you have nothing to stand upon unless you judge by the Gospel and the Torah, it says to the Jews and Christians. But when we look at those scriptures, the Gospel and the Torah, we see that their teachings very, very clearly and directly, irrefutably, completely contradict with Islam and are incompatible with Islam. So if Islam affirms the truth, the revelation and the preservation of the Gospel, for example, and we look at the Gospel and we see therein that it has that its main message, its main doctrine is completely in contradiction with Islam, that would mean that Islam is affirming something that refutes Islam as true. So, and this is exactly what it does. The Quran further on, for example, later on, explicitly rejects that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is divine, that Jesus is, as it says, one of three, or that Allah is part of three, for example. And it says that anyone who believes that the Messiah is God is a disbeliever who is condemned to hell, and for him there is no helper. But this is directly what is confirmed in the Gospels, and this is directly the Gospel message. This is the New Testament message. So the idea there is that Islam directly affirms what refutes Islam, and the angle here specifically is when we focus on the aspect of Christianity. As said, the Quran clearly affirms that the Gospel was revealed, is a revelation by Allah, and that it was perfectly preserved, that it exists today, that it is still authoritative. The Quran never at any point whatsoever says that the Gospel has been textually corrupted. Muslims will only appeal to one or two parts where the Quran says that certain people write texts and say this is from God, but it never says anything like that about the Gospel. So it is only left with affirming the Gospel as authentic and true and authoritative. And the Quran also, on top of that, says very, very clearly that Allah will confirm and help and uphold and make superior those immediate followers and disciples of Jesus who believed in him and who did not reject him and who did not want him crucified. And they will be superior, they will be made superior from that day, from Jesus' earliest historical evidence that we have is that Christianity was understood pretty much exactly the way it is today by the earliest Christians and by his disciples. Even atheist and secular scholars will admit that by the time of the death and resurrection of Jesus, his immediate disciples believed that he is God, that he is the Son of God. They began worshiping him. So we can establish this very, very firmly. Now, we take all this information with the Quran affirming the gospel, but also directly praising and validating the earliest followers of Jesus. What we are left with is that the truth which Allah in the Quran hints at or explicitly confirms is that Jesus is the Messiah, that he was crucified, that he resurrected, that he is the Son of God, that he is divine, and that salvation is only through him. However, as I just said, all of this contradicts with the Quran itself, which explicitly rejects its doctrines. Now, why does the Quran reject it? Because the Quran initially tried to appeal to Christians and Jews to win them over. Chronologically speaking, the earliest revelations of the Quran that mention Christians just try to appease them and try to make it look like, hey, guys, we are the same. Later on, as Muhammad interacts more and more with Christians and Jews, and they don't agree with him, the Quran becomes increasingly more hostile toward Christians and Jews, and eventually ends up rejecting and condemning the religious beliefs of Jews and Christians. But at that point, it has already shot itself in the foot, because it has already completely affirmed the beliefs that Jews and Christians have. So this is a very strong internal critique and clear logical incoherence within Islam. And what we can say, a good advice for Christians here would be, what we can do with all of this is to approach Muslims, if you want to approach Muslims, for example, and tell them about what the gospel actually is, what the New Testament is, what the Gospels actually say about Jesus, what the earliest Christians actually believed, what the evidence, what all evidence shows us about what Christianity actually is, and what Christ, what Jesus actually taught to his disciples. We are very clear and convinced, historically, religiously, that what he taught to his disciples, or what his disciples believed, was the divinity of Jesus, that salvation is only through him, that he is the Son. Muslims have to somehow make peace with this idea. They somehow have to deal with it, or they have to eventually, if they don't want to believe all of this, they have to end up rejecting the message of Jesus and rejecting the message of his disciples. They have to end up rejecting Christ himself. But if they do that, they also necessarily have to reject the Quran, which affirms the authority of Jesus and his disciples. So, and Muslims generally wouldn't, they wouldn't just throw away their own religion because they want to deny Christianity. So they are left with a few options, and at that point you can jump in and invite them to Christianity, which is a much better system than Islam. When it comes to charity, for example, Islam also has ideas like giving charity, but with Christianity it is we do things that are good because they are good, and because God wants us to be good, and because we want to be like God, we want to be like Christ. We want to do what is good and abstain from what is evil. That is the Christian way. In Islam, it doesn't quite work that way. In Islam, people do not simply, take the example of what is good and do good for that sake, or abstain from evil for the sake of abstaining from evil. It is rather a complete reward versus punishment system. In Islam, if you do something that Allah does not or doesn't want you to do, or tells you not to do, you are punished severely and brutally, and the Quran contains very graphic descriptions of what that punishment looks like. Whereas when you do something that Allah wants you to do, you do it because you want to receive rewards from Allah. It is basically like a point-based system where even Muslims who believe in Islam, according to the Islamic belief, are not guaranteed heaven. They are, most people, actually most Muslims, according to the Islamic belief itself, end up going to hell for a while, where they have to be punished for all their sins. And so all the sins that you commit on earth, Allah will pay back in terms of very brutal punishments, such as burning and burning away your skin and restoring it and burning it again and making punishments and the suffering and want to do good instead, so that your goodness points can increase and you can be rewarded by Allah. So it is less about simply doing good for the sake of good, or because you love God, and abstaining from evil because evil is simply something, you know, that is not good, or you dislike it. It is much less human. And if Muslims are introduced to how Christianity is versus how Islam is, they might understand better that this is actually a moral system that is not so arbitrary, and so Islam is more like training, you know, in very cruel ways, training an animal, and whereas Christianity is simply more human. It acknowledges your humanity, it acknowledges your shortcomings, it acknowledges your fallenness, it acknowledges your potential to be good and to be like God in the ways that He allows you to be. And this is a much more beautiful system, aside from the fact that Christianity is actually supported with evidence in history, whereas Islam is not.
Yes, it is a grace-based system, Christianity, unlike any other world religion, including Islam. In fact, the shortest summary I've ever heard of it is 3 sentences, 3 short sentences. God created it, we broke it, Jesus fixed it. Jesus fixed our inequity, our sin, by coming to earth and taking our punishment upon Himself. And then by trusting in Him, we're not only forgiven, but given His righteousness. Whereas in Islam, the only way you can be assured you're going to make it to paradise is to die as a martyr in jihad, according to one of the hadith. In fact, I brought that up on Bill Maher's show 25 years ago. It used to be called Politically Incorrect. I was debating a Muslim on that show, and I said, you know, when Jesus said, what are the greatest 2 commandments? He said, love God and love your neighbor. When Allah was asked, or when Muhammad was asked the same question, he said, acknowledge that Allah, there's only one God, Allah, and Muhammad is prophet. And the second is to commit jihad for Allah. And it's been put this way, that in Islam, your son dies for Allah. In Christianity, God's son dies for you. And that actually is what literally happens, that Jesus comes into this world as God's son and takes our punishment upon Himself. It's a complete system of grace. You don't earn it, you don't achieve it, you receive it. And then, out of love for what God has done for you, you can express your love back to God and to other people, to bring other people into the kingdom, to make God known, to know God through Jesus, and to make Him known. That's why we're here, to make heaven crowded. Much more with the Apostle.